Hello, I'm Danny Musically. This presentation will explore the use of Dublin core metadata elements to catalog a collection of whiskey bottles. Though mods would probably have been my first choice for creating whiskey bottle metadata, I chose Dublin core. Mods would have been more flexible for these items because of the custom tags, but I did want to explore a different scheme, and Dublin core's main elements do seem to work for physical objects. I'm interested in the digital representation of physical artifacts. I have some experience working with metadata for digital objects like images, audio, documents, and records, so I wanted to explore physical objects for this project instead. I chose the whiskey bottles mostly because they are the only collection I have access to that includes items with enough characteristics to develop metadata records, aside from maybe shoes. However, I also think that the whiskey bottles are interesting objects to catalog because the metadata about them can focus on a few different broad topics depending on the needs of the repository. The environment for these records is a special collection for consumption and maybe sale. These are bottles that my husband and I have collected over the last 5 years, which is certainly not long in the whiskey world. I'll create metadata for them as if they are part of a larger, more robust collection, such as one in a specialty whiskey shop. A large enough collection would need some sort of metadata to help distinguish between similar bottles or bottles from the same distillery. This would support customer browsing and help them with finding bottles with certain tasting notes, origins, and other characteristics. Just like many other artifacts, whiskey bottles have certain basic characteristics such as names, creators, and numerical identifiers. Dublin Core uses a publisher element, which translates well to the producers or distributors of the bottles. Sometimes it's not the same as the distillery, especially if the bottles are imported. These bibliographic elements support search and browsing in much the same way as the metadata for more traditional objects like books and audiovisual media. Collectors will browse by distillery or creator, or search for a specific name. However, as with many other types of artifacts, there are specific characteristics to consider when creating metadata for whiskey bottles. If the collection is for actual consumption, it would be helpful to include tasting notes. The flavor profile of whiskey is usually broken down by nose, palate, and finish, much like other liquors and wine. It is important to note that tasting notes are very subjective, and they often have nothing to do with the distilling process or the actual contents of the whiskey. But amateur collectors, like my husband and me, do use tasting notes in decision-making about whiskey collecting. I can also imagine cataloging whiskey bottles as art artifacts, as some bottles and their labels are quite beautiful. Distilleries produce special batches, sometimes through collaboration with other distilleries or celebrities, and these are celebrated with special edition bottles. Other times, collector's edition bottles are created to celebrate a distillery's anniversary, for example. It may also be that the bottles in a whiskey collection are historical artifacts, and not for consumption at all. My family has a split neck bottle of Benedictine and brandy that's over 100 years old and almost certainly not drinkable anymore. I'm not very familiar with museum metadata, but a metadata record could conceivably include more detailed descriptive information about the bottle for collections like these. And the origin of the grain or the whiskeys used in a blend may be useful information to include in a record. Consumers are becoming more interested in food origin, sustainability, and labor, and tracking the metadata on the ingredients used in the distilling process may be of note for certain collectors. Others may be interested in the origin of the whiskeys because it represents a unique blend, more common in American whiskeys, or the location has a special significance to the collector. And sometimes flavor profiles are linked to certain regions, as is common in Scotch whiskeys. I did look for schema related to food metadata, and it seems that is an area being explored by the Internet Society's Internet of Food Special Interest Group. Other research by the USDA and some scholars has begun compiling nutrition databases and food ontologies to address trends in diet, health, and wellness. The digital representation of food can be significant for research policy, dietary guidance, and product development, but there currently is not a standard for this kind of data. It seems that liquor stores use very simple taxonomies for their sales, and most of their metadata includes the category of whiskey and the price. This isn't super helpful for distinguishing between different bottles in the same category. There are a lot of different bourbons out there. BevMo's website has more than 150 bottles to sift through. So I used the Dublin core generator from exercises 1 and 2 for this project. Most of the elements included in the generator apply to the information about whiskey bottles. The tool is very simple. It includes the core elements of Dublin core and allows you to duplicate elements as necessary. Each element includes a link to the documentation to explain what kind of information should be included. Once the fields are filled, you can generate the record as XML, HTML, or XHTML, and include certain additional tags and references. I will use the simple version and only include the core tags in the records for this project. My template includes most of the Dublin core elements. Some of the elements are pretty clear for the information about the whiskey bottles, and some benefit from a brief explanation. My records often include 2 titles, one for the name of the whiskey and one for the age statement. I separated these because they are often separated on the labels themselves. And in single malt whiskeys, the age is very important. I used the Library of Congress subject headings, but found them pretty limiting. They only include whiskey, bourbon whiskey, Scotch whiskey, and rye whiskey. There are other types of whiskey. I added a second subject for each record to note whether the whiskey was single malt or blended, and this helps differentiate certain bottles that are not bourbon, Scotch, or rye. Most records will include 4 description elements: bottle, nose, palate, and finish, unless the tasting notes were not available. Unless they were provided on the bottle, most of the tasting notes were taken from the Master of Malt website, which catalogs most well-known whiskey bottles. The last few elements are fairly self-explanatory. I decided to use format to describe the volume of the bottles and coverage to describe the location of the distillery. This is a stretch beyond the DCMI intention for coverage, but since there's not much information content on a whiskey bottle, in most cases anyway, I thought the geographic coverage of the physical contents of the bottle would suffice. And here are the records. I also included a photo of each bottle to support their digital representation. Please excuse the amateur quality. I created the first record as my template. Having a bottle in front of me to determine which elements were relevant and what information to include made the template creation process much easier. This record is an example of a creator or distillery and publisher or distributor being different. This bottle is from a Japanese distillery, but it was purchased in Luxembourg, so the distributor is European. British, in fact, which is a little odd considering. This tiny bottle was purchased in Edinburgh, Scotland, but since it technically is a sample, it does not have a UPC code. I put unknown in the identifier field. This is another Japanese whiskey, this time purchased in the United States, so it has a different distributor from the previous one. I'll also note that these Japanese whiskeys are the reason I included the secondary subject element. These are very similar to Scotch, but since they aren't Scottish whiskeys, I did not want to use that subject heading, much like the champagne versus sparkling wine argument. I used the general whiskey heading instead, and then included a second subject to note that it is a single malt whiskey. This was the first bottle that had a decorative component other than the label. I tried to describe it very briefly in the description element. This one was a little trickier since it's from a small distillery. Could not make out any year stamp on the bottom of the bottle, and I struggled to find tasting notes online. This is when I wondered whether catalogers are allowed to use their sense of taste when cataloging food objects. This is another one from a small distillery. I had some trouble finding tasting notes here as well. This one has 2 creators because it's the result of a collaboration between the Lagavulin Distillery and actor Nick Offerman. Fans of Parks and Recreation will appreciate the significance here. This batch is aged in barrels from the Guinness Brewery in Baltimore, so I included them as a contributor as well. This one is a blended whiskey that includes bourbon and rye. I didn't already have a standard for this style, and I decided not to make a special note since the goal of this collection does not need specific information about the grain and liquor origins. I included this bottle mostly because the label is actually primarily in Japanese, on the back of it anyway. The bottle itself was purchased in Japan, and it's my husband's favorite. Note that it's empty. The name is very similar to another Yamazaki bottle in the collection, so the other metadata in the records helps distinguish between the two. In this case, the distillery edition means it can only be purchased at the distillery in Japan. And finally, a small batch from a small distillery. There is very little information online about this whiskey, and I could not find tasting notes anywhere, so I included a note in the description element to that effect. Since it's a special bottle, I did include an additional description about the batch and bottle numbers. And finally, here are some reflections on the process of cataloging these whiskey bottles. One consideration I didn't include in my template is price, though this certainly is a factor for some collectors, especially us amateurs living on teacher salaries. There really wasn't a great place to put price in the Dublin core elements, which is why I didn't think to include it at first. If the collection is a for sale collection, it would be useful to include a range. Obviously, prices will vary to some degree. I approached this project as a private collection more than a shop, so I decided not to retroactively add price to a description element. Another consideration is the tasting notes or the flavor profile of the whiskey. If you're in a shop and ask the expert there, they can help you find a whiskey that matches your tastes. But if you're browsing independently, it is practically impossible to know what a whiskey tastes like just from reading the label. I mentioned before that the tasting notes are highly subjective. They are the flavors that experts are reminded of when they taste a whiskey. This doesn't bode well for standardization because it is so subjective. The matrix here on the slide is an attempt to categorize whiskey flavors by the Diageo Beverage Company, and it is more useful than the fairly arbitrary tasting notes. Does the whiskey lean more towards delicate or smoky, light or rich? That's pretty simple and could make for a great beginning to a flavor-based schema for whiskey. The issue is that these grids are almost always regarding Scotch. There's a lot more whiskey than just Scotch. I did find one grid for bourbon, but it includes completely different categories: spicy or smooth, oak or corn. Whiskey collections relying on metadata would benefit from the development of a controlled vocabulary for whiskey flavors across the different styles. Though this would be a tough endeavor since flavor isn't a hierarchy, and different types of whiskey have pretty different flavor profiles, as demonstrated by the differences in these grids. And after creating record 8, I considered adding a coverage or description tag for origin of the whiskey components like the grain or the types of whiskey. The breaking and entering whiskey from St. George makes a big deal about the types of whiskey in their blend. It's part of the brand. They stole different whiskeys to make a new, better blend with their own to represent American whiskey in general. But the amount of research needed to find this information for most of the other bottles was just too much. While it's interesting information, it doesn't seem all that important based on the labels for the other bottles. I can see how it would be useful for search and browsing if a user is looking for blends using rye, for example. This is a reasonable use case, but the records in this project focus much more on the flavor profile than the details of the whiskey's origin, so it doesn't match the purpose of these records well enough to put in the extra effort to track down all that information, if it's even available at all. Well, thanks for listening. Many of these sources helped confirm that there doesn't seem to be a standard scheme for food and beverage representation online at this moment. The images in the presentation are either my own photographs or they are credited here as well. And some of the sources helped in defining the Dublin core elements and creating the templates for the records. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.